the difference between rich and poor we are talking about here is long-term and firmly established, and it was brought to New Zealand in a revolution around about 1984, which dumped the mixed economy and brought in a privatised capitalism, which we're living within now. I believe that the solution lies in a socialism which will bring in nationalised industry, high taxes and the spread of power. That was just a hint of some. It's a huge problem and it's not going to be solved by just fiddling around the edges. So I want to ask the panel what change in the economic and political system they think would lead to a solution of this problem. Whether they agree with me or they think we can just go on as we are.
Thank you. Colin, would you like to have a go at that? A bit mean of me, but here you go.
It's a bit loud. You have to recognise, I can refer you to Dani Roderick's book as one among many, but Dani Roderick I think is particularly interesting on the latest stage of globalisation. And he refers to it as hyper-globalisation. And that a more tight weaving together of national societies and economies, particularly the economies, and that limits the degree to which you can go down the socialist route. It limits the degree of that's what I referred to right towards the end of the. We've got a problem with feedback. Where do I go? How close do I get? What do I do best? Way over. Okay. It limits the degree, the freedom of action of national governments because of that high interconnection. And I can give a number of examples of that, but it goes along with much greater interconnection. So there's interdependency and interconnection which are different from 5 years ago. And therefore, if we must think in terms of, we must think very imaginatively about the way in which we want societies and economies to operate, which is what I was trying to suggest. And that's where we have to be very imaginative. And how much national scope do we have in that? We do have some, and we're not using all of it.
Thanks, Colin. Any other questions? I can see someone down here in front. Off you go.
Greetings. Yeah, this is a question particularly for Philippa, based on your work on the expert advisory panel for the Children's Commissioner report. It's about sort of the universal versus targeted services and benefits. When that was put to John Key, I think his response was something along the lines of, it's a dopey suggestion because that also reaches middle income and wealthy people, and what we're looking for is much more sort of intelligent targeting. What's your answer to that?
Okay. Well, as I mentioned before, I think that the answer for really key redistribution is a universal, and I think particularly because the very young and the very old are vulnerable, I think that universality is really important there, as also sort of health services, sort of going to hospital. When you need to go to hospital, you need to go, so we make that universal in the attempt to actually charge people for something. Now there's an important argument that underlies this. Not only is it kind of fair and just and humane, but it means that they're much more efficient taxes, are much more effective. If you start targeting people who feel stigmatised by it, people who feel that they feel humiliated by the process of getting it, and so there's a very low take-up. Working for families, which was universal, if you met the criteria, there's a huge take-up. It's actually an example in the OECD of a very effective way to roll out a program. Moreover, I listened to Mr. Key say that, our Prime Minister say that, and I thought there's a very fine book by Julian McGraw called Not Only the Poor, and it says basically in a cohesive society where we realise that we all share the pleasures and vulnerabilities of bringing up children, our own or nieces and nephews. Actually, if we all see that that's a role that we do together, then he would see it as a really important job to model that and to say, okay, I've got children, I will also receive it, I'll also pay taxes if I actually don't need it, but I'll receive it because I'm going to model, there's this important thing that every parent does the best for their child. So for me, it doesn't cut ice to say, oh, I don't need to take my salary, or, you know, I'll send my children to private school, or I don't need this benefit, and it's dopey if I did. I would say, here's a chance as a rangatira to really model the fact that we all care about our children, and then to pay our taxes in turn if it turns out that we don't need it.
If I add just to that, if I go back to that notion of common purpose, then a criterion for judging how you would, judging whether a policy is appropriate or not, would be whether it contributes to common purpose or erodes common purpose.
I'm looking for other hands up there.
I've got one. You have to excuse my European naivety on the issue, but since arriving in New Zealand, one of the things that's really struck me was the inequality of access to the things we associate with the modern lifestyle. And one thing in particular I was thinking of was the access to internet. And this might just because I'm coming from a Finnish perspective, where access to internet, broadband internet, is actually a constitutionally kind of a law enshrined right. And this is particularly a question for Stephanie McIntyre, because you touched on it briefly, about the access to better rates for energy companies, for people who can access better payment schemes, things like that. I was just wondering what you thought about that in the context of New Zealand, particularly in relation to political will that Philippa Howden-Chapman touched on. Thank you.
Well, I think there's a myth that things like internet access is very widely available, and I think it is a myth, because undoubtedly there are people for whom they're not living at places where that's a possibility. You know, I mean, I concur with what you're saying. I think it's all these things add up. Some of them are quite small things, but collectively they add to the weight and burden that's disproportionately borne by people who are really poor in New Zealand. I'm not sure if that's enough to answer that for you.
Spent time in Finland. I think Finland's a country that New Zealand should pay. That Finland should pay much more attention to. I think Adam Smith pointed out that, you know, equality was about doing things that other people could. So I absolutely agree that broadband is really important. I think it's great that the City Council has brought in that CBD free access. I know exactly where it is on the bus, where I can switch on to it and switch off to it. So I think that's really great. So city councils can also redistribute services, and they've done it in partnership with various banks and businesses. So I think these things they can steer in a way that I think is extremely positive. I should mention just briefly, we've done a comparison between Finland and New Zealand in the last recession with Finnish colleagues. Ilmo Kiskibaki, and basically the Finns, when they had much worse unemployment than we did, their rate of youth suicide actually went down because everybody in Finland tightened their belts, and there was a drop in across the board in terms of lowering wages, and there was a very active labour market policy for actually young people. We didn't do that in New Zealand in the 1990s, and youth suicide went up. We're not really doing it now, and sadly, association it may be, but we predicted that actually youth suicide would go up again, and that's what's happening at the moment.
Can I just add another dimension rather than just access? There's an example of a group of schools in East Auckland, in East Tamaki, DSL 1 to 3, and they've introduced for all kids, and all the parents pay a little bit towards it, tablets or access to the internet, and they teach in that context. And it's now been running for about 4 years, so it's just getting to the stage where you can make some considered judgments on it. Truancy has dropped to near zero. They've got the average of achievement up to about the national average of all these other schools. I'm not saying it's a magic bullet, but it's not just what you have access to, it's what you do with it. And I think this is a particularly inventive project.
Kia ora koutou. Two questions run together. Can the erosion of fatherhood have had anything to do with the present situation? And is it not sensible to have an incentive for families for when the child matures?
Maybe I could, the children's grant, I mean, I can see that that's a heartfelt question. The Children's Commission, our working group, actually considered that, and one of the things that we think is really problematic in New Zealand is when the father pays money and for supported child support, it doesn't go directly to the family, to the children. And so in the cases of in the strange situations, the children don't know actually that the father is actually paying money into them, into their family budget, and we've recommended that the money paid should go, a portion of that should go to the children and the family, so that they know that the father is still connected with the family. And I think there's some very direct conduits that should be tied up better than that. And I think I think we should celebrate children growing up and being healthy and happy, rather than just waiting around for those ghastly statistics of who's taken their own life. So I like the idea of celebrating a child successfully launched into the world.
Hi. Philippa, you mentioned values, and I'm really interested in taking that up through my own personal experience. I wonder if the values reflect a much bigger problem, and the income comes into it, which is an erosion of what it is to be Kiwi. And I'll give you my personal example. I've been overseas for 10 years and just come back to New Zealand with my young family. And one of the reasons for coming back to New Zealand was the fact that I'm a big surfer, and I want my child to have that ability, as well as tramping the Tararua. And I also want my daughter to have the influence of the biculturalism, because in my early experiences, I remember one of my Māori friends welcoming me into his house and saying, you know, for us, this is wealth. And he opened the fridge, and it was a full fridge, and he said, you know, to be able to share that with you as a visitor, that's what it is to be wealthy. And I've always remembered that, and I've always thought, well, that would be, when I've been overseas, that would be a fantastic place to come back to. You've got the environment, we're passionate about it, we've got this wonderful bicultural element which sort of balances the sort of Western views of wealth and so on. But to be honest, I've been a little bit shocked having come back after 10 years, because I don't see a lot of either of those. I actually see an erosion of that, and more of a sort of a capitalist mindset and an individualistic mindset. I'm wondering if you could sort of comment on that.
You're talking about a fellow surfer who decided to come back for much the same reasons. And my answer is that we're all part of the solution. And actually it's discussions like this, doing something, that there are a lot of people who feel similarly to you. A lot of people who put a lot of time into lots of things like Steph does, or the Children's Commission, on the basis we didn't want it just to be a great country to come back and bring up your children, but to be a great country to be a child. And so you're articulate, you've got energy, you've obviously got skills, do it. And you're